My fellow African people and the SADC community in particular, the tension between Zimbabwe and Zambia is slowly getting out of hand. You see, the Zimbabwean President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, recently met the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, and he took that opportunity, by he I mean the Zimbabwean President, he took that opportunity to criticize the Zambian foreign policy, falling mind-numbingly short of calling Zambia a colony of America. What a diplomatic blunder by the Zimbabwean President. This is unprecedented. Pun intended. You see, Zimbabwe will soon host the SADC Heads of State Summit this coming August. What that means is SADC will soon have a chairman who has broken the SADC Brotherhood Code. Well, of course, by saying Brotherhood Code, I am overlooking the fact that Tanzania is the only SADC member state that is ruled by a sister. So I suppose I should actually say ED has broken the SADC Brotherhood and a sister code. But, well, this code was established before the sister came to power, so I suppose we can continue calling it the SADC Brotherhood Code. But then again, we don't want to make the sister feel lonely like ED. So maybe let's continue calling it the SADC Brotherhood and a Sister Code. But today, we want to take a closer look at this Zimbabwe rift, this Zimbabwe fiasco. Is President Hakainde Hichilema a Western puppet planted by the Americans to advance a regime change agenda in Zimbabwe? Lastly, and I say this jokingly, will Zimbabwe and Zambia go to war over ownership of the Victoria Falls? If God forbid that were to happen, then my Zambian brothers, please, may we not send our soldiers to die in that pointless war. I propose that we should organize a boxing match between our two leaders. Let them box it out between the two of them, and whoever wins that boxing match renders his country the undisputed owner of the Victoria Falls. I'm joking. Fellow Sadzaitas, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasnamalites, varugujgarais, nevasnamarites. Welcome to the special report. In my first year of secondary education, my history teacher taught me that history is the study of past events in order to predict the future. So, we can't talk of the current Zimbabwe tensions without looking at the history of these two countries. Because understanding where these two countries are coming from historically will give us a better appreciation of some of the things that are happening today. You see, Zimbabwe and Zambia share a history, a whole history. Just like President Mnangagwa said, once upon a time, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi were once one country. From 1953 to 1963, this country was called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, established by the British together with the white settlers in the three amalgamated territories, led of course by the settlers in southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe was southern Rhodesia, Zambia was northern Rhodesia, and Malawi was Nyasaland, hence the name Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. But the establishment of this federation coincided with calls for the liberation of Africa. This was during the era of African Enlightenment and black nationalism. So the Africans in the three amalgamated territories rejected and resisted the federation amid widespread protests and activism. So they not only wanted to see the dissolution of this federation, they also wanted total unconditional black majority rule. The liberation movement in southern Rhodesia, ZAPU, was led by Joshua Nkomo, The liberation movement in Northern Rhodesia, UNIP, was led by Kenneth Kaunda, and the liberation movement in Nyasaland, the MCP, was led by Kamuzu Banda. These three, Nkomo, Banda, and Kaunda, were very good friends, particularly Nkomo and Kaunda. Their relationship would influence many events that happened during the Zimbabwe liberation struggle. So, the British finally gave in to pressure and granted Malawi independence in 1964, followed by Zambia 3 months later. This meant that Zambia and Malawi were granted independence without having to fight a war of liberation. Kamuzu Banda became the first president of Malawi, and 3 months later, Kenneth Kaunda became the first president of Zambia. Remember, this was 1964. It's also the same year Ian Smith became Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia. He completely resisted the British plan of granting independence to Zimbabwe on the basis of majority rule. And so, in order to avoid taking orders from Britain, Ian Smith unilaterally declared independence from Britain without majority rule. This was in November 1965, a year after the independence of Zambia. This means, from 1965, Southern Rhodesia was an independent country, but without majority rule. By this time, Joshua Nkomo's party, ZAPU, had split. There was now a new party called ZANU, led by Ndabaningi Stole, with Robert Mugabe as its Secretary General. Initially, African leaders did not take ZANU seriously. The ZANU leaders were seen as renegades who were disrupting the course of the struggle. It took a while for ZANU to be fully accepted as a real player. Kenneth Kaunda in particular always preferred his friend Joshua Nkomo. There was a bro code between Kaunda, Nkomo, and Banda that their respective countries would gain independence with the three of them at the helm, and that they would assist and support each other to achieve that goal. Of course, Banda and Kaunda made it, but Joshua Nkomo didn't. And as I said, his party, ZAPU, split, and this created a new party called ZANU. Both ZAPU and ZANU were based in Zambia, where they were allowed to establish military bases from which they launched the liberation struggle. So there you have it. In earnest, the Zimbabwean liberation struggle started from Zambia. And so, after many years of warfare, the regional leaders, who by this time were known as the frontline states, decided to stop the war and force all the liberation movements to unite under one leader and one party. By this time, there were 4 groupings: ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo; ZANU, led by Ndabaningi Stole; Frolizi, led by James Shikerema; and the ANC, led by Abel Muzorewa. Please, don't confuse this ANC with the UANC. If you want to know the difference, do watch my video titled The Story of Bishop Abel Muzorewa. I find that a lot of people confuse these two, the ANC and the UANC. They don't even know when the UANC came into the picture. But anyway, as I was saying, the frontline states decided to force these 4 groupings to unite under one leader and one party and negotiate with Ian Smith for majority rule. Initially, ZANU was divided on this issue, but its leaders were forced by Kaunda and Nyerere to give in. But the ZANU leaders were soon to be given the biggest shock of their life. Kaunda wanted his friend Joshua Nkomo to be the president of the new unified party. You see, Kaunda's voice carried a lot of weight because, as I said earlier, the Zimbabwean freedom fighters were based in Zambia. The Zambians endured a lot of military attacks and bombings from the Rhodesian military as punishment for housing and nurturing ZAPU and ZANU. So the frontline states begged Kaunda's proposal for Joshua Nkomo to lead the new unified party of all the Zimbabwean liberation movements. However, The notion that Joshua Nkomo was to lead the new unified party was a non-starter for ZANU. And so, after hours of deliberations and quarreling, the four parties settled for Bishop Abel Muzorewa. And so, on the 8th of December 1974, these four political parties signed the first Zimbabwean Unity Accord and united under the banner of the ANC with Bishop Abel Muzorewa as their president. This is what led to the Victoria Falls talks that took place right at the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia on the Victoria Falls Bridge during the detente period. Of course, the talks yielded nothing because Ian Smith was never really interested and ZANU was never really invested. Joshua Nkomo would soon wrestle power from Muzorewa and became president of the ANC with the blessing of his friend, President Kaunda, and he would go on to hold talks with Ian Smith, but nothing came out of it because, like I said, Smith was never really interested. And so, the end result was that Ian Smith missed a golden opportunity to reach an internationally recognized settlement with the moderate Muzorewa and the less radical Joshua Nkomo. This was a big mistake, a very, very big mistake, one that changed the fortunes of Zimbabwe forever. Anyway, a year later, Herbert Chitepo was assassinated in Zambia. This is a subject for another day. I literally need to do an entire video concerning this issue. The Zambian authorities quickly rounded up many leaders of ZANU and arrested them in connection with Chitepo's death. Tongogara and a few other Zanla High Command leaders managed to escape to Mozambique and handed themselves over to the authorities in that country, hoping to get protection. But they were soon deported back to Zambia, where Tongo himself was imprisoned for nearly 18 months, enduring torture in the process as the Zambian authorities sought to force out confessions regarding the assassination of the legendary ZANU chairman, Herbert Chitepo. Tongo was released in 1976, just in time for the Geneva Conference. Fast forward to 1979. Zambia again hosted the Commonwealth Heads of State and Government Summit, which is the conference that gave birth to the Lancaster House Conference, which in turn crafted the pathway to majority rule in Zimbabwe, which culminated in the 1980 elections, which were won by ZANU, and ZANU has been in power to this day. So you can see that Zambia played a very pivotal role in liberating Zimbabwe. Even when ZANU relocated to Tanzania and Mozambique, ZAPU remained in Zambia until independence. So there is no Zimbabwe without Zambia. So this is why I was a little surprised by President Mnangagwa's words. He says, and he was saying this to President Vladimir Putin, he goes, "The West has just begun consolidating its power in Zambia, our next door neighbor. You know, there was a time when Zambia and Zimbabwe were one. It was called Northern and Southern Rhodesia. It was made one by the British, but they are now separate. And the Americans are consolidating their power in that country, both in terms of security and in terms of financial support to Zambia to make sure that we feel lonely. But that will not change us because we have taken a course as a people that we feel we want to be independent and we will choose our friends ourselves. And besides, we are independent today because most of us in the leadership trained here during our war of liberation. We got our independence because we were supported by yourselves here. And we don't forget that history, and you don't forget about us." These are the words of President Mnangagwa. Now, balance me here, my fellow Africans. President Mnangagwa talks of the Zimbabwe-Russia relationship. He praises Russia for its contribution in liberating Zimbabwe. Yet, when he talks about Zambia, he simply mentions that time when Zimbabwe and Zambia were one. He doesn't even attempt mentioning and acknowledging the contribution of Zambia in liberating Zimbabwe. Almost as if to downplay the contribution of Zambia in the liberation of Zimbabwe. Okay, fine. I appreciate that this was not the platform to talk about the contribution of Zambia in liberating Zimbabwe, but it was also not the platform to casually criticize a fellow SADC member state. The Americans are consolidating their power in Zambia to make us feel lonely, he says. He went on to say, but we don't care about that because we choose you, Russia. After all, it's only right that we choose you because we are independent today because of you. Now, when ED says stuff like that, it gives the vibe, the impression that what the Zambians did in liberating Zimbabwe is not that important, at least when compared to what the Russians did. The Americans are consolidating their power in Zambia, but we choose to be independent. We choose you, Russia, because we are independent today because of you. By interpretation, President Mnangagwa is simply saying Zambia is not our ally because Zambia is a friend of America. A friend of my enemy is my enemy too. By saying that America is consolidating its power in Zambia, President ED is simply saying the Americans are taking over Zambia. That is what consolidation of power means. The process of strengthening your authority and establishing your dominance, whether politically, economically, or militarily. The effect of this is that a sitting head of state of a SADC member state is publicly criticizing the foreign policy of a fellow SADC member state. This is against the statutes laid out in the SADC Treaty. If you want to know more about the SADC Treaty and how SADC functions, please watch my video titled The History of SADC. It's available on my YouTube channel. So, President Mnangagwa becomes the third president in SADC to criticize the affairs of a fellow SADC member state. The first president to do so was the late Zambian President, Levi Mwanawasa, may his soul rest in peace. He criticized the ZANU-PF government for the 2008 electoral violence in Zimbabwe. The then president of Botswana, Ian Khama, followed suit. He criticized the ZANU-PF government for the said violence and even took in the late opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai, who ran away from Zimbabwe fearing for his life. And may his soul rest in peace. The difference though is that these two presidents, Mwanawasa and Ian Khama, were quoting the SADC Treaty in their criticism of the ZANU-PF government. They were criticizing the electoral violence. The SADC Protocol on Politics, Defense and Security says that extreme violence is a ground that can warrant a SADC intervention. And true to their criticism, SADC ended up intervening. In Zimbabwe, there is no president in the SADC region who has ever publicly criticized or attacked Zimbabwe's foreign and economic policies. Even during the hyperinflationary period around 2008. That is what it means to respect the sovereignty of a nation, particularly your neighboring country. So, if Zimbabwe is threatened by Zambia's foreign policy, shouldn't those things be discussed within the framework of SADC and the AU? Is it Pan-African to complain about a SADC member state to a foreign superpower? Is ED not doing the same thing that he's accusing Hakainde Hichilema of doing? Because ED says Hakainde Hichilema has aligned himself with Biden. Well, is ED not aligning himself with Putin and casually soiling the image of Zambia in the process by casting aspersions? Is that Pan-Africanism? Dumping the West only to become subservient to the East? Have you ever noticed that many African leaders who preach Pan-Africanism are despotic and tyrannical? It seems Pan-Africanism is an excuse used by dictators to propagate their dictatorial tendencies. What is Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism is about black consciousness, It's about the sense and spirit of brotherhood among Africans and those of African descent. The common goal being the unity of Africa and the complete eradication of colonialism and neocolonialism. Pan-Africanism means putting Africa first before all else. So, if you are an African president and you have issues with another African president, it's like a misunderstanding with your blood brother. So you fix your issues within the family. And who are the family members? President Ramaphosa, President William Ruto, President Paul Kagame, and many other African presidents. Not President Vladimir Putin, not President Joe Biden, no. I say this to expose the so-called Pan-Africanists who don't practice the gospel of Pan-Africanism which they preach daily on international platforms. I beseech you therefore, sirs, by the mercies of God, practice what you preach. But really, this Zimbabwe fiasco, this Zimbabwe rift, this Zimbabwe tension started last year during the Zimbabwe harmonized elections. You see, President Hakainde Hichilema, in his capacity as the chairperson of the SADC organ on politics, defense and security, which is also responsible for elections in the SADC region, appointed Nevas Mumba to lead the SADC Observer Mission, which issued a damning report and condemned the Zimbabwean election. This enraged and angered ZANU-PF members, and they started attacking President Hakainde Hichilema, calling him a Western puppet planted by the Americans to advance the regime change agenda in Zimbabwe. They even did a documentary which was aired on ZBC for the sole purpose of linking Nevas Mumba and Hakainde Hichilema to the American regime change agenda. Well, the Zambians were not to be outdone. They even did some protests, marching against leading members of ZANU-PF like Patrick Chinamasa, who together with Chris Muchangwa were leading the anti-HH campaign. The kupi kuchawira chimbo nedowe. What's gonna happen? Are these two leaders, HH and ED, going to continue pretending like they like each other when we can clearly see that their relationship is disintegrating right before our very eyes? Well, whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.